Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and today I'm doing another one of those author's take on videos, but this time I'm doing it on something a bit more specific than just a general concept, because there is something in particular I want to discuss from the gift that keeps on giving, Avengers Endgame. I've seen a lot of think pieces pop up online attempting to justify, well, honestly, everything in Endgame that doesn't make sense or could have been done better. But in particular, one thing a lot of people have been trying to justify is the story arc of Thor, and where his character winds up by the end of that movie. And, well, as I said in a previous video, I do not think that was the way his character should have gone, nor do I think it was the way his character was naturally going to progress, or regress as the case may be. But I want to go into more detail about that, and I'm doing this as an author's take on video because I do think there are some lessons to be learned in terms of character writing and story writing in general. So just stick with me, and I will get to that point after I go through what exactly went on with Thor, from beginning to Endgame. Now bear in mind, I'm still in the camp that says Endgame was not a terrible movie. I'm never going to call it a good movie per se. It's a movie I enjoyed, sure, it had good emotional moments, but the more I think about it, the less it holds up. I'm not opposed to things like the portrayal of Tony Stark or Nebula or things like that. There are still good things. I will never take that away from it. But I am focusing on Thor here because I want to be as clear as possible on this matter. So most of the recent pieces I've seen discussing Thor's journey always make a point of saying that there's a complete arc told for Thor, beginning with Thor Ragnarok. And right there is the first mistake. Thor Ragnarok is not the beginning of Thor's story. Call me old-fashioned, but I believe the best place to start analyzing a character's story from beginning to end is at the beginning. Ragnarok is not the beginning. Ragnarok was the third solo Thor movie and the fifth overall appearance of the character. To really understand Thor's journey, we need to start at the actual beginning, with the 2010 Thor solo film. Don't get me wrong, folks, I don't think those movies are the best Marvel movies either. I ranked them pretty low when I ranked all the movies pre-Infinity War. But that being said, just because I don't think they're the best Marvel movies doesn't mean we can just ignore them. They are vital parts of the journey, and also key to understanding why Endgame completely botched everything. Alright, so in the 2010 film, what is Thor like when we first meet him? In a word, he's childish. He's arrogant, he's boastful, he's headstrong, he's a spotlight hog, he gets his friends in trouble, his own brother is out to get him because he's sick of living in an egotist's shadow, he nearly starts a war because his pride was wounded. Thor's not really a good person when we first see him in that film. And since he's acting childish, Odin treats him like a child, punishing him by taking away his toys and grounding him, or in this case, taking away his ability to wield Mjolnir and banishing him to Earth without powers. It's all a lesson in humility, not to mention to learn the great responsibility that comes with having great power. And that's not the last time I'll be making such an allusion, but be patient, there will be more to come on that regard later. By the end of the 2010 film, Thor has a brand new perspective. He realizes that his arrogance and his childishness not only affected him, but affected everything around him. And he had to step up and be a more mature individual to not only get his powers back, but to set everything right in the universe. And the lessons learned carry over into the Avengers. Remember that scene he has with Loki? If you think that you are fit to rule because you are better than everyone, then you miss the truth of ruling. Being the ruler doesn't mean you just get to lord your power over everyone. It means you're responsible for everyone. You have to, in a way, serve the people. And that's what Thor does by being a hero. He's no longer in it for his own glory. He's in it for the protection of the world, and all worlds, in fact. And that idea of being responsible for protecting all worlds carries over into Thor the Dark World, where we see that's exactly what he does. he is taking it upon himself to protect all of the realms by fighting on the front lines. And since he successfully keeps the universe from being destroyed by Malekith and the Dark Elves, by the end he reaches a conclusion that he thinks is still a mature one. More on that in a second. He tells who he thinks is Odin that he's just not ready to take the throne, and he may not even think the throne is his place to begin with. Where he belongs is on Earth, fighting alongside the Avengers and working on that relationship with the girl who will never appear again after that. But of course, the audience is immediately let in on what a huge mistake Thor has just made when we see that who he thought was Odin is actually Loki in disguise. By shirking his responsibility to the throne, the villain has taken control. Again, Thor probably thinks he made a good choice, a mature choice even. But it was a mistake, and he realizes that in Avengers Age of Ultron, when he has that vision of Ragnarok in that weird little vision pool thing. In that film, he realizes that he's been neglecting his own people, and he needs to go back because there's something much worse looming on the horizon that he will eventually need to deal with. And that finally brings us to Thor Ragnarok, which is actually the conclusion of this first leg of Thor's journey. When we first see Thor in that film, he is in a very comfortable place. He's still being the hero. He's not necessarily in it for his own glory, he's past that now, but he is still in his comfort zone. He still thinks that it's just not his place to be in charge of Asgard. But he learns quickly that he kind of has to be. It's interesting, actually, that Ragnarok pulls the same stunt with Thor that Iron Man 3 pulled with Tony Stark, in that it takes away all of his crutches. The primary reason Thor has had an excuse to not take the throne of Asgard is because he's always had people there to cover the bases for him. Odin still has the throne as far as he knows, so the established king can be there and do what he does. The Warriors 3 and Sif will protect the kingdom in his absence, and Thor of course has Mjolnir, his hammer that only he can wield, and that he can defeat any enemy by wielding. Thor Ragnarok then proceeds to take all of that stuff away. Odin can't take the throne anymore because he's dead, and no way is Loki getting it back. The Warriors 3 are dead, and Sif is MIA. And of course, Mjolnir gets destroyed by Hela, and in the aftermath of the hammer's destruction, Thor winds up in a situation where he basically has to step up and take charge. I mean, he's got allies there, but none of them are fit to lead. The Hulk is a trusted friend, but also kind of acting like a toddler. Loki is Loki. He's untrustworthy. He could turn on Thor at any moment. Valkyrie used to be a great warrior, but now she's kind of acting like a coward and has become an apathetic drunk. Korg, he has the will to be a revolutionary, but not the ability to actually follow through with it. Essentially, Thor has to take charge and organize all these people into some kind of unit that will allow victory. Or at least enough of a victory to get off of Sakaar and back to Asgard, where Thor realizes that he basically has to take the throne for the good of all the Asgardians. And when he finally gets to that point, he realizes that he doesn't need those crutches anymore. He can be the leader. He can win. He can make those tough decisions that might not result in a clean victory, but will still result in the right outcome. And he didn't even need the hammer. His power is innate. He is all-powerful without a tool. By the end of that film, Thor has not only succeeded his father, he's surpassed him. He deserves to sit on that throne, and he deserves to be the king of Asgard. And that completes a particular arc for him. It's not the end of Thor's story, certainly. There are still many interesting stories you can tell about a character who is both a superhero and a king. I mean, that's what they're going to do with Black Panther. But Thor is in that situation now, too. And in a very different place than he was before, where he doesn't actually need all the things he was leaning on prior to that moment in order to be the hero. That's why I said earlier that it was a good conclusion to that first leg of Thor's journey. And then along came Infinity War and Endgame. Infinity War started things off subtly. I admit, I actually did kind of think that Thor's journey in that film was definitely one of the better parts, and him and Rocket and Groot actually made for an interesting team-up. Yet I still can't deny that the primary purpose of this whole journey was to regress Thor from where he was at the end of Ragnarok. Like I said, Thor ended that film by realizing he didn't need all of those things, all of those crutches to support him. He could be his own hero without all of those safety nets. And his entire journey throughout Infinity War is to get a new weapon. A weapon which we established he didn't need, but for some reason he does need one in Infinity War. So that point was completely missed. But it all culminated in the worst way possible with Endgame. And like I said, I do get what they were going for, but there's just no justifying how it was done. Now I'm sure the question will inevitably come up of how I would have done it better. But I don't even have to answer that question because Marvel already produced an answer for me. It's called Spider-Man Into the SpiderVerse. SpiderVerse features a version of Peter Parker who is in a very similar place to Endgame Thor. He's also made a lot of mistakes. He's also washed up. He's also got a potbelly. He's also retreated from everything and is just hiding and wallowing in his own misery. And similarly to Thor, there are some jokes made at his expense. I will not deny that. But there is a key difference in terms of how that humor is handled. Perhaps I should be more specific. There's a key difference in when the humor is implemented. You see, Thor in Endgame is always made a joke. His whole thing, he's clearly suffering from PTSD, he's clearly a pathetic character who needs sympathy, but it's always treated as humor. Ha ha, cheese whiz runs through his veins. Ha ha, he's fat. Ha ha, he's just an online gamer now who trash talks people. And it doesn't feel like they're really taking it seriously. And that's not just my interpretation. Audiences always laugh at this sort of thing, and there are multiple interviews with the Russo brothers where they say they were treating it as a comedic thing. Basically, Endgame reduces Thor to a joke, never really allowing him to have a truly dramatic moment. And every time it seems like they're about to go that way, another joke happens and completely disrupts the mood. It's almost as if the filmmakers were going, well, gee, if we get too heavy with this, we might lose the audience. I know, let's put a joke in here so we can win them back over and not have them think too hard about the emotional impact of this. Let's basically just jingle our keys in their faces and amuse them. That's not the sort of thing I expect from a live-action movie with an older audience in mind. It's the sort of thing I expect from an animated movie with a younger audience in mind. Yet that self-same animated movie, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, also treats Peter as a joke at times, but when it gets serious, it gets serious. You may recall that all the different spider heroes need to get back to their respective dimensions because they cannot survive in Miles' dimension. If they stay there too long, they will eventually disintegrate atom by atom, slowly and painfully. It's a horrible way to die. So they need to get back to their own dimensions. But they've also got to close the dimension opening machine because it'll tear Miles' dimension apart. Peter opts to stay behind and close it, because eventually the other heroes determine Miles just isn't ready. So he opts to stay behind, partly to show that he is still a hero, but also because he feels he's got nothing left to live for. He screwed up his entire life. He's afraid of going back. So he'd much rather stay behind and have a meaningful death. That is hardcore. And it's not disrupted by a joke. In fact, that's just one dramatic moment in a much longer sequence of dramatic moments that has one well-placed joke to help break the tension and, keep us from being too overwhelmed by it. But originally, that sequence had two jokes, and one of them was cut because it was very poorly timed. Honestly, it's kind of weird. I know that the people who are talking about Thor's journey in Endgame and why it makes sense also saw Spider-Man Into the SpiderVerse, and it's crazy that I haven't seen any of them making this comparison. Probably because if they did, they'd realize Spider-Verse really did do it better. But it's not just the seriousness. It's also where Thor winds up at the end. Look, Thor retreating after a grand failure. I get that. I get that maybe that would be in character for him. Maybe he is the sort of person who, when he fails to save the entire universe, would take it really hard and would allow himself to just let himself go and become pathetic like that. So how do I justify the fact that he stays there? The thing is, I can't, and neither can anyone else, no matter how hard you may try. It's all in that final scene he has with Valkyrie that makes you realize Thor has actually regressed to a point that's practically where he was at the start of his first movie. Remember, he basically gives up the throne, again, which we've established many times in the past is not a good idea, and he gives it to Valkyrie, who I really don't think is a good choice for that, because she also responded to crushing failure by hiding herself away and drinking herself into a stupor, and we haven't really seen any evidence that she won't do that again if the right circumstances come along to push her in that direction. And how does he justify all of this? He says it's because it's time for him to start being who he is and not who he was meant to be. So, all of that growth, all of that maturity, all of that journey he took, getting to the point where he was ready to be a leader and he didn't need all of his tools, and he realized that his place, the best place he could be to do the most good in the world, was to be the king of Asgard, crumpled up into a little ball, thrown in the toilet, urinated on, and flushed away. I mean, that's basically saying he's rejected all of his growth. All that stuff he did in the past movies doesn't matter anymore. It's all wasted time. He's just going to go off and do his own thing like he did in the first couple of movies that resulted in so much trouble. And just as the icing of the cake, he's once again leaving the kingdom in the hands of someone who might not be the best choice for a leader. Again, look at what SpiderVerse did. Peter goes back to his dimension, and he's ready to try and rebuild. He's going to take another shot with Mary Jane and maybe start that family. Maybe he'll even get back into being a proper Spider-Man and protecting the city if it needs him. That's a place that he needed to get back to. But with Thor, when presented with the possibility of getting back to where he's supposed to be, he rejects it. So again, I am baffled that so many people think this is where Thor was supposed to go and where his trajectory was always taking him. I don't see it. At all. So what sort of writing lesson can be taken away from all of this? Well, first of all, there's the idea of treating your characters with a certain sense of dignity and knowing when to be funny and when to be serious. A moment of humor to break up a really intense moment, that's not a bad thing. But when you keep doing it and you never allow the emotion to actually reach a head, basically, when you never allow the drama to peak, you rob the audience and the characters of a catharsis. You want another better example? Look at Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. There are also a lot of moments in there where it seems like scenes are starting to get serious and then suddenly they disrupt it with a joke, but then at a certain point you realize, oh, the characters are doing that because they're deflecting and they're trying to avoid facing that emotion. But now, at the end, we've gotten to a point where they can't keep doing that, and they have to face the reality of who they are and how they feel. That did not happen in Endgame. But if you really want to get down to the source of the problem, you can kind of trace it back to the fact that this is a shared universe we're talking about, where each chapter is being made by a completely different team. And even with one person at the top overseeing it all, things are eventually going to conflict at some point. It's kind of a too many cooks scenario. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against the idea of a shared universe. In fact, I'm going to do a whole different video on that subject at a later date. But it can have its problems, and this is one of them. Eventually, you're going to bring someone on board who wants to take the story in this direction, in spite of the fact that it was actually aimed in that direction. So, when that happens, and trust me, it's inevitable in this kind of scenario, you basically have to either allow it to happen and face the critiques that will come, or put your foot down and either tell this other person who wants to disrupt everything to play ball, or else get someone else to do the job instead. Because otherwise, you may as well just put pennies on the track and wait for the inevitable train wreck. As for Thor himself, Chris Hemsworth has apparently signed on to do at least a few more movies. The exact number of how many varies from source to source, but he's apparently one of the few Phase 1 heroes who's not done yet. The question is, though, where do you go with a character who has just been completely ruined, especially as thoroughly as Thor has been ruined? I mean, I suppose they could try to build him back up again, but that would practically be just recycling what we've already seen. And I'm sure people will say there are the unworthy Thor comics that they could base their story on, but I don't really know if I trust them to do that at this point. Either way, Marvel's committed to this version of Thor now. And they've got to somehow figure out a way to deal with him and make him work. That's going to require a lot of fixes, including not making him such a punchline, and getting him back to a point where his character growth doesn't feel like a waste of time. It's not going to be easy. And that's the sort of thing that any writer in this kind of scenario would also have to face. So there are lessons to be learned from Avengers Endgame in regards to Thor's story. Mostly they're by way of negative examples. Which, you know, an example is an example. However, just in case some of you still aren't quite convinced that this was a disruption, I want you to think about the one word that is associated with Thor almost more than any other. Worthy. Thor has to be worthy to pick up the hammer. Otherwise, he can't. Now, ask yourself, what makes Thor worthy in Endgame? His entire journey, up until that point, from the first Thor movie through to Ragnarok, was getting to a place where he wasn't just worthy, he was the worthiest. Now that that's gone, what's the point? Even the word worthy no longer has meaning for him, because even at his lowest, most sorry state, where he is just a walking punchline that's as pathetic as can be, somehow he's still able to wield the hammer. It's like those consolation trophies you give to the losing team at a sports game. If the whole point of being Thor is to be worthy, and Thor is no longer truly worthy in these movies, then what was the point of all those films beforehand? I'll just let you contemplate that question for a little while. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.